that dysfunction in childhood, especially amongst caregivers, where we have parents who struggle with emotion regulation dynamics and sense of self that's healthy, validation, that especially in dysfunctional family systems, we tend to see a lot of division and splitting of roles. Like, you're the good child, you're the bad child. You're smart, you're pretty, you're dumb, you're a failure, whatever it is. You're never really here. That these dynamics often play out and the parents actively reinforce them. And some of the research shows that it's not even so much the fact that there is a role, although that's a problem, it's the rigidity of the role. It's like, this is who you are and this is what you're allowed to do and be, and that's it, that cements again and again and again these dynamics. So I did some research. I was trying to understand kind of how these roles, how we can group them. There are often a handful of these roles that get repeated in a lot of literature, a lot of the articles. And there's one new role I'm going to share that has come out of a research article I found as it relates to the newer dynamic of helicopter parenting. So let's get into it. The first thing to understand is that, actually I found this quote and it said, it's from Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, that every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. And so I think that's important to say, because even though I'm giving you these classic labels, the way they might play out, the little nuances might be a bit different. Every family organizes in its own way and continues to organize. For example, we can have a golden child that falls from grace and a new golden child take on these roles. And I will say, I was thinking, as someone who has 4 kids but is an only child, what happened for me? And I think it's important to see these as emotional, psychological roles and not necessarily as individual children in yourself. You might find that you took on many different roles in a system, right? Or maybe there are 6 kids, but 2 or 3 of them are in these certain roles, whatever it is, and they shifted, like I'm saying, or they're just individual experiences of how you respond in a role to these kind of parents. Now, these are going to be most common in narcissistic families or families where there's a lot of, like I'm saying, an inability to see the kids as separate, as children, as a healthy family system, where there's responsiveness and validation more often than not, where adults own their behavior, where they model emotional maturity more often than not perfectly, but where there's a general sense of stability and safety, and you know that you're not walking on eggshells or that love is conditional, things like that. So that's where we're going to see it the most, like I'm saying. And one article actually talked about that certain roles, for example, like the role of scapegoat and the lost child, having a more significant inclination towards things like depression, right? So each of the roles can take on these additional dynamics, although I would argue that any one of them, including even the golden child, for example, which is like often the coveted role, it seems like, can have its own set of consequences and sacrifices and impact. Number 1, I'm going to call this the hero and the golden child. They're often separated, but you'll also see them as hero, golden child, the saint. And at the core, these are the kids who reflect back, hey, this family isn't so bad. This kid got into a great college. This one is running a company. This one is beautiful, whatever, successful. They kind of represent, and especially narcissistic parents, look how great we are, because these kids hold a lot of the positive projections of these parents, right? All the good things they want to be associated with and reflect back to them. Look how great we are. So these kids can often do no wrong. They are the ones that are sparkly and shiny for whatever reason. But the way it manifests is in a lot of perfectionism for these kids, right? So they're driven by, I have to stay sparkly and shiny in some way. And so there's a lot of internal criticism, a lot of really intense shaming to keep them successful. And because they actually receive mental, physical, financial rewards for being these children, they realize pretty quickly that if I don't behave a certain way, respond a certain way, perform a certain way, I may not stay in this role. And when they look back, for example, the hero, the golden child, at the scapegoated child we're going to talk about, or other kids, they go, yeah, that role sucks. I don't want that one, right? That's an active rejection of resources, time, love, attention. So they get stuck in this hamster wheel of trying to stay in this role. And they often start to believe that that's who they are, that they are only worthy when they're performing. And then they realize deep inside it's a performance. And that's where that fraud part can set in for them later, where they're like, I don't really feel like I'm these things, even if the outside world or accolades, and especially the parents, reinforce that. So we see a lot of overworking, workaholism, overdoing, driven by shame, a lot of anxiety, often addictions to maintain these things, a lot of projections. We can see a lot of emotional lack of boundaries by the parent. So the parent parentifies them and says, you're my best friend, has that child operate in a role like parent to shame or blame other siblings, or to help raise them. A lot of guilt. And these kids can often even engage in bullying other siblings and kind of aligning with the narcissistic parents, like everyone else is so stupid and dumb and we're so great. It depends on how much exposure they have to those parents. Do they live with them? Do they not? But they will actively mask and oftentimes engage in narcissistic behaviors as well to kind of keep that alignment because they get so much benefit. And so we can see a lot of difficulty at the core of who they really are and their sensitivities about their sense of self and identity, because so much of their life has been a performance. As I just said, another video I made about golden children is that for many of them, they have these natural gifts, right? They're good at sports. They're good students. It just comes easy for them. They're born attractive. And so it's like they can't really help those things, but the narcissistic parents, especially dysfunctional families, really attach to that because it feels so good for these parents to go, oh, look how gorgeous Tommy is. Look how smart so-and-so is, whatever. The next child is often the lost or invisible child. This is the dreaming child, the child who learns that by not being noticed, that is the best way to go through the family system dynamics. And so they often survive unnoticed, but they never really feel seen. They might seem like they're fine on the outside, but they're often struggling with low self-esteem and worthiness. Often they're indecisive, they can be quiet, and they learn don't make waves. The scapegoat child, that's not the role I want. I can't necessarily or naturally be the golden child. And so they often dissociate and dream. They might isolate a lot to deal with these dynamics. They can live in these deep, rich fantasy worlds as a coping mechanism. And they don't really get to practice asserting themselves and communicating because their job was to really not communicate, right? So they often have a hard time in relationships, speaking their mind, expressing themselves. That's kind of how it plays out. And a lot of identity issues. And once again, who am I? I think all of these kids can have them in certain ways. For example, the scapegoated child, if they make a healthy break, can create identity, but it can also be a very toxic and unhealthy way of coping with that role. So it can depend. But that's the goal here. The goal is don't have needs, don't be seen, disappear, and dream and dissociate. And that's how you get through it. And of course, that's going to have its own issues in their adult lives. The third type is the scapegoat or black sheep of the family. This is what it sounds like. This is the outlier. It's often the truth teller of the family. It can be the opposite of the hero. And so everyone says, well, you're the reason for the problem. These kids can actually have a lot of problems. They've been on the receiving end of so much of the trauma, of the projection, of the whatever. They're sensitive kids that they can have a lot of mental health issues, addiction issues. They can also be just the kid who just walks their own path. And in the best case scenario, they have a greater sense of self by going, I'm not in this crazy system. I'm not who you guys are. And if that happens without other significant addiction or mental health issues, it can actually be very healthy for them. But they're often the black sheep, right? They're not invited to things. They're blamed for things. So as long as they are aware of the system and out of it, it can be okay for them. But the problem is many of them are still labeled and kind of acting out the chaos of the system. They don't know that yet, that it's not them. And so they take on the role. We often call them in therapy the identified patient, right? Everyone says, oh, Johnny's the problem. And if Johnny just wasn't an addict, we'd all be okay. And that may be true that the addiction causes problems, but it doesn't mean that the rest of the family isn't a problem and isn't acting out certain behaviors and roles that are part of where all this came from and or part of the maintaining of this dynamic. So we can see a lot of PTSD here. These are the actor-outers, right? Everyone says you're the problem. And if they believe they're the problem, but also are kind of holding the truth, that's where I think it kind of really manifests in their own chaotic behaviors and difficulties. The next one is the mascot. This is the child who deflects and diffuses, often uses humor. Everyone look over here, right? And they are basically drawing attention away from the problems. They can relieve the tension of the family system and the dynamics. I would say they're often very anxious and hypervigilant. You see a lot of comedians, I think, talk about this, where it's like they have their own issues. They might seem chill and fine and funny, but they're often really they're scanning to make sure that they don't need to intervene and relieve the tension. So it can be a lot of hidden internal dynamics around that regard. And they can be very anxious. They can be very avoidant in relationships, right? They're like, I'm not going to go with my emotions because that's not a safe thing, but I feel a lot of emotion. So there's a lot of dynamics there. And they're really trying to escape true emotional vulnerability because their role has been to diffuse any of the feelings and keep everyone sort of distracted. The next one is often the caretaker child. This is often also the parentified child at the core, but like I said, you can also see parentification in the golden child or hero child. And these are the kids that learn and grow up to manage everyone's emotions. They sacrifice themselves, they take the hit, and they learn to their job is to literally, physically, mentally, emotionally caretake the parents, the other siblings. It's all about everyone else. These are often pleasers. And their job is to fix others while denying themselves. They can struggle with boundaries and often be drawn to their own tendencies to find emotionally unavailable partners. It doesn't seem like it because they're such compulsive, good, wonderful caretakers, but there's really a way, if I make it about you, it's never about me. And so it's a way to minimize their own pain. They're often, those who are trying to manage conflict and soothe. And once again, these are often very hypervigilant kids. I think all of them are in these systems and it kind of plays out in different ways, but they're often scanning for needs, right? So they're trying to always see what does everybody else need so that I can be okay. That is the role they operated in and the one that kept them safe in childhood. And the last one is, as I mentioned, one that came out of the research I found talking about this element with kids who historically in the newer dynamic in the last, I would say, 20 years, been helicoptered, where they were never told no. The parents made the world feel seamless and smooth. These are the parents who were always overdoing everything. And so these kids at the core, they're calling masterminds. And the reason why is that they basically feel like the world always goes their way, right? So they mastermind everything. Everything works out for them. They make it happen, but really their needs have been minimized, the truth, their bruises and reality and mistakes, but they don't necessarily know that. So they think of themselves in a much greater light. And I don't know that it said this, but I think they'd be more at risk for more narcissistic, selfish, arrogant behaviors because they've never really been told no, but they think it's because of their own great powers, not because their parent was basically removing all obstacles, trying to make the world the least invasive for them. And so they didn't really develop as many tools and skills to manage life's disappointments and difficulties. And actually, I was going to add one more, which is really it kind of can go with all of these, but I would say it's more common in that caretaker pleaser role, which is mediator. So this is often the child who acts in a role of, the parents are fighting and they intervene, or they manage the sibling conflict. They're always trying to keep the peace and mediate. And once again, that's a denial of themselves and an external focus on everyone else, which helps minimize their own pain, their own stories, their own needs and desires. So those are the core, I think, roles. I think, like I said, it's important to understand that they can vary. You can be booted out of one and into the other, although we tend to see them more consistently. By and large, it's important to understand that there's a job in every role, and every role has a consequence and a sacrifice of self and identity. And the belief system is that, but this is how I must be. And the truth is, it's not just a belief system. If they're going to get their needs met, especially with narcissistic parents, they have to sort of understand their role. For example, if they're the golden child, they are motivated to stay in it, right? So the problem is, once they are the scapegoated role, whatever it is, it can be harder to change those dynamics. And so it's the most coveted roles that get the most reward. But oftentimes there's only room for one child in that system to be in those roles. So I'll talk more, I think, in the future about these in terms of these kind of parents, because I think what happens when each roles grow up and choose partners, for example, what happens when the lost child ends up with a mascot, things like that. I think it can get challenging. And I also think the way that we manage these roles is often through our trauma responses, like fight, flight, freeze, fawn, collapse, submit, and attach, cry out for help. So we're going to have more patterns where these are the roles we had, and this is how we deal with it, right? We compulsively overwork, like in a flight pattern. We compulsively push back, like in a fight pattern, things like that. We shut down, freeze, whatever, to deal with these dynamics. So for example, we would see a more often freezing response for a lost child who's dissociating, things like that. We might see a more fight or flight pattern or flight pattern in a golden child who has learned to sort of overwork, things like that, to kind of get that accolade and reward. Anyway, I can share more about that if you want later. Thanks for being here. Please feel free to share your thoughts and feelings, and I will see you next time. Stay safe and well. Take care. Bye.